91%. That's how many men never came home. They called them the samurai of the sea, Japan's carrier crews, the most elite naval aviators the world had ever seen, trained to perfection, bound by honor, feared by every enemy they faced. But by 1945, almost every one of them was dead. Their ships, once symbols of national pride, lay silent beneath black waves. What happened to the most formidable carrier fleet on Earth? How did a force so disciplined, so devoted, collapse into fire and silence in just 3 years? The answer isn't just military. It's human. It's a story of faith turned fatal, of courage consumed by arrogance. It's about the men who believed that spirit alone could conquer steel, and the empire that demanded everything from them except survival. This is the untold story of Japan's doomed carrier fleet and the order that sealed their fate. If stories like this fascinate you, the hidden human side of war, the triumphs, the tragedies, the choices that changed history, then stick around. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dive documentaries, and share this video with someone who loves history told honestly, not glorified. It helps the channel grow and keep stories like this alive for the next generation. It began not with war, but with envy. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan was watching the Western world dominate the oceans with steel monsters that could level cities from miles away. The British ruled the waves, the Americans followed close behind, and somewhere in between, the island nation of Japan looked out across the Pacific and asked a dangerous question. Why not us? The old samurai spirit had found a new battlefield. The sea would become their proving ground. After defeating Russia in 1905, Japan believed it had earned a seat among the great powers. But the West didn't see it that way. Every treaty, every restriction whispered the same insult. You are not our equal. And nothing cut deeper than the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which capped Japan's navy at a fraction of America's size. But hidden inside that humiliation was opportunity. If Japan couldn't build bigger ships, it would build smarter ones. That's when the aircraft carrier slipped quietly into history. While the world obsessed over battleships, the giants with their city-killing guns, Japan's naval engineers saw potential in something lighter, faster, and infinitely more flexible. In converted hulls like Akagi and Kaga, steel decks replaced cannons, and aircraft replaced shells. To traditional admirals, they looked absurd. Floating airfields with no real armor, no massive guns, no soul. But to a new generation of officers, they were the future. Japan's carrier program became a national obsession, a blend of art and engineering fueled by pride. And beneath that pride was something even more dangerous, a belief that the nation's destiny could be shaped not by material power, but by willpower alone. This fusion of Bushido, the ancient code of the warrior, and modern technology created something the world had never seen, a fleet that worshipped both steel and spirit. By the 1930s, Japan's carriers had become more than weapons. They were symbols. Each one embodied the empire's hunger for legitimacy and its faith in its own mythology. The Crane sisters, Shokaku and Zuikaku, glided across the Pacific like visions of perfection. Their decks gleamed under the sun. Their crews moved with ritualistic precision. Every launch, every landing, every salute was a performance for the gods of war. Propaganda films showed them slicing through the ocean as proof that Japan was unstoppable. But what the cameras didn't show was the imbalance beneath that beauty. The cramped hangars packed with volatile fuel, the minimal armor, the lack of proper damage control. Japan had poured everything into the blade, nothing into the shield. Its admirals had convinced themselves that sheer discipline could make up for any flaw. After all, to them, courage could plug holes faster than pumps. And for a time, it worked. When Japan's first air fleet, Kido Butai, was finally assembled, It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. 6 carriers operating together as a single synchronized machine. The United States hadn't even imagined such coordination. Japan had turned its carriers into extensions of a single mind. To outsiders, it looked like genius. To the men on those decks, it felt like destiny. They were part of something greater, a living weapon meant to rewrite history. But beneath the roaring engines and rising sun flags, a question lingered like a shadow. What happens when faith meets reality? When the enemy refuses to break? When the sea stops listening to spirit? And when fire doesn't care how brave you are? The answer was coming. And it would arrive not with triumph, but with smoke. They called it training. But for the young men who stepped into Japan's naval air schools, it felt more like purification. The Imperial Navy didn't just teach you to fly, it stripped you down, body and soul, and rebuilt you into something harder, something obedient. Recruits arrived with dreams of glory, inspired by newsreels showing sleek Zeros rising from gleaming carrier decks. What they found instead were shouting instructors, endless drills, and a world where failure wasn't corrected. It was punished. Candidates flew until their hands bled, memorized maneuvers until exhaustion blurred the horizon, and learned that hesitation was shame. Out of every 100 who began training, barely half survived to see a cockpit. And those who did, they weren't just pilots. They were symbols of Japan's unyielding faith, proof that spirit could conquer flesh. Every flight was a sermon in the sky. Before takeoff, they bowed toward the imperial palace, whispering silent oaths to the emperor, a man they would never meet, but whom they believed watched every move. To die for him is to live forever, their instructors said, and they believed it. These weren't just lessons in aviation. They were indoctrinations in destiny. The Bushido Code, once written for sword-bearing samurai, had been reborn in leather helmets and flight goggles. Courage was sacred. Doubt was weakness. Survival was never the goal. Success was. When a cadet crashed, there were no tears, just quiet nods and murmured words about honor. Every funeral was framed as victory. The empire didn't need survivors. It needed martyrs. This culture of sacrifice seeped into every deck plate, every bolt of the carriers themselves. Firefighting drills were rare. Damage control was an afterthought. Why waste time preparing to survive when victory meant dying in glory? Commanders wrote doctrines assuming that if their ships burned, the men would go down willingly. Engineers designed hangars to cram in more planes, not to contain explosions. The Imperial Navy worshipped offense, the perfect strike, the single decisive blow that would bring the enemy to his knees. It was an intoxicating dream, and Japan's early successes made it seem real. In the late 1930s, Japanese carrier planes dominated the skies over China, crushing resistance with speed and precision. The admirals saw this and nodded. Proof that their doctrine worked, proof that faith was enough. But faith has a cruel way of turning into blindness. By the eve of war, Japan had forged the sharpest blade on earth and dulled its own instincts in the process. The men who walked those carrier decks were fearless, but fragile. Their discipline was unmatched, but their leaders had built a system that punished caution and rewarded zeal. They believed in the myth of invincibility, and myths have a way of devouring the people who live by them. As 1941 approached, Japan's carrier crews polished their aircraft and prepared for war, not knowing they were perfecting their own destruction. The empire had built warriors who would never surrender, sailors who would never abandon ship, and pilots who would never return. Their loyalty was total, and soon the world would see the terrible cost of absolute faith. Every empire needs a myth to believe in. For Japan's Navy, that myth was called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. It was an idea born long before the first shot of the Pacific War, back when admirals still dreamed in the language of battleships. They believed victory didn't come from endless campaigns or attrition, but from one perfect clash, a single, thunderous engagement that would settle the fate of nations. One stroke of the sword, and the ocean itself would decide who ruled the Pacific. It sounded poetic, almost spiritual, and that was exactly the problem. Japan's strategy had stopped being a plan. It had become a prophecy. Every ship, every man, every drop of fuel was devoted to chasing that one glorious confrontation that might never come. The aircraft carrier changed everything, but not enough. Japan's leaders saw these new ships as the key to delivering that decisive strike. Instead of meeting America's battleships gun for gun, they would crush them from the air before a single shell was fired. It was brilliant in theory, a synthesis of old honor and new technology. But doctrine, like concrete, hardens over time. The Imperial Navy clung to the dream even as reality shifted beneath its feet. War had become industrial, mechanical, relentless, yet Japan still planned for a single beautiful duel. Every carrier mission was designed not to grind down the enemy, but to lure him into that mythical confrontation. And while America built shipyards and flight schools by the hundreds, Japan built faith. You can almost feel the tension between the two worlds, spirit and arithmetic. On one side, engineers, pilots, and strategists whispering warnings that endurance mattered more than courage, that training new men was worth more than worshiping old heroes. On the other, the admirals, proud, unyielding, still chasing the ghost of Tsushima, where Japan had crushed Russia's fleet decades earlier. They believed history would repeat itself, the decisive battle would come, and when it did, the gods would favor Japan again. The danger wasn't arrogance alone, it was momentum. No one dared question the myth, because the myth had become the engine of the empire itself. And when faith is that strong, even truth can't stop it. So Japan prepared for a war it could win only once. By late 1941, the plan was in motion. Carriers would sail across the Pacific, strike a crippling blow, and force America to negotiate before its vast industry could awaken. It was a gamble, but it fit the narrative perfectly. Fast, decisive, heroic. The admirals didn't want a long war. They wanted a legendary one. And for a moment, it looked like they might get it. As the carriers left their hidden harbors under a frozen northern sky, their decks loaded with sleek silver planes, none of the men aboard could imagine the future waiting beyond the horizon. To them, the decisive battle wasn't just coming, it was destiny. They didn't yet know that destiny had other plans. The sea was calm on the morning the world changed. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers crept silently across the North Pacific. Their decks shimmered with frost, their aircraft lined up like sleeping hawks. The men aboard knew almost nothing about their mission, only that it would strike a blow so great, so sudden, it might end the war before it truly began. Orders were sealed, radios were silent. The fleet was a ghost gliding through mist and secrecy, but below decks, tension buzzed like static. Young pilots clutched lucky charms from home, a photo, a ribbon, a letter tucked under a flight jacket. Veterans, stone-faced, checked their instruments for the 1,000th time. Then, as dawn bled over the horizon, the signal came. A single word. Tora. Tiger. Engines screamed to life. One by one, Zero fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes clawed into the air. From above, it must have looked almost peaceful. Hundreds of aircraft rising in perfect formation, heading toward paradise. Below, the sailors on deck could only watch until the roar faded into the clouds. Then they waited. Hours stretched like years. And somewhere far to the south, the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Battleships erupted in fire, hangars exploded, the Pacific trembled. Within 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet was crippled. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands dead or wounded. On the Japanese carriers, Cheers echoed through steel corridors. They had done it. The unthinkable. A nation half a world away had been struck without warning, and the Empire's flag now seemed unstoppable. For a moment, Japan's dream of the decisive battle felt real, but beneath the celebration, a fatal illusion was taking root. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not the decisive battle Japan imagined. It was only the beginning of a storm. The carriers returned home to parades and praise, hailed as divine instruments of the Emperor's will. Newspapers printed photographs of pilots smiling beneath cherry blossoms. Propaganda films turned the raid into legend. But the victory had blinded Japan's leaders. They believed they had broken America's spirit. In truth, they had only awakened it. While Japan measured its success in emotion, the United States measured in numbers, and the numbers were merciless. Within weeks, American factories roared to life, churning out planes faster than Japan could count. Training schools filled with new pilots. Every blow Japan struck only made its enemy stronger. Yet in Tokyo, the admirals told themselves that Bushido would carry them through. They had mistaken shock for surrender. For the men who had flown over Pearl Harbor, triumph felt holy, almost sacred. They had been told they were instruments of destiny, warriors born to deliver judgment, and for a time they believed it. But beneath that pride lay something more fragile: exhaustion, fear, and the quiet knowledge that the war they'd just begun would not end quickly. Even as the carriers refueled and resupplied, orders came for new missions, more raids, more conquests, more chances to die gloriously. Japan's empire was expanding, but so was its shadow. The same fate that had lifted it into the sky was beginning to blind it to the horizon ahead. Pearl Harbor was not the end of the story, it was the spark. The ocean had accepted the challenge, and it would answer, not with surrender, but with fire. The ocean was still that morning, too still. To the Japanese fleet steaming toward a tiny speck in the Pacific called Midway, it felt almost like another training run. The sky was clear, the sea calm, and the confidence absolute. 4 of Japan's mightiest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, moved in perfect formation, their decks alive with activity. Pilots laughed quietly, crewmen checked bombs and fuel lines with the rhythm of long habit. The air smelled of oil and salt and cigarette smoke. For months, victory had been effortless. The Empire's flag had risen over island after island, sea after sea, and now this, the battle that would end America's resistance once and for all. The decisive clash had finally come. No one aboard those ships could imagine that by sunset, nearly all of them would be gone. It began, as disasters often do, with confidence mistaken for control. Japan believed its enemy broken, a beaten fleet barely able to stand. The plan was bold: lure what remained of America's carriers into a trap near Midway, crush them, and force the U.S. to the negotiating table. But intelligence had already betrayed them. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval cipher. The trap was exposed and reversed. As the Japanese planes bombed Midway Island, American aircraft were already closing in from the horizon. At first, the attack seemed pitiful, clumsy torpedo bombers arriving in waves, most shot down before they could strike. Japanese gunners cheered as the sky filled with smoke trails and burning wrecks. It looked like another easy victory. Then, through that chaos, from the high blue above the clouds, came the sound that changed everything: the scream of dive bombers. They fell like iron rain. Out of the sun, dozens of American aircraft plunged toward the Japanese carriers. Alarms blared. Crewmen shouted warnings. It was already too late. Bombs struck Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu within minutes, one after another. The explosions tore through hangars crammed with fueled planes and loaded bombs. The fires raced through corridors, devouring everything: men, machines, oxygen. On deck, sailors ran blind through smoke, throwing themselves into a sea already burning with spilled fuel. Admiral Nagumo watched from his flagship as the inferno consumed it, powerless to save his men. Within hours, 3 carriers were floating infernos, their crews trapped or already gone. Only Hiryu survived long enough to launch a desperate counterattack, crippling the U.S. carrier Yorktown before the American planes found her, too. By nightfall, she too was gone, and with her, the last hope of Japan's carrier supremacy. Midway was more than a battle. It was the moment the ocean turned against Japan. Over 3,000 sailors and aviators died within a single day. The Empire's most experienced pilots, the same men who had flown over Pearl Harbor, were gone forever. Their replacements would never match their skill. Japan had lost not just ships, but time. Time it could never replace. The survivors watched the smoke fade into the sunset, realizing too late that their doctrine, their pride, their belief in invincibility had led them here. Midway wasn't fate, it was the bill coming due. From that day on, Japan would be fighting a war it could no longer win, and the ocean, once its ally, had become its executioner. By 1944, the Empire was running out of sky. The Japanese carrier fleet that had once seemed unstoppable was now a shadow of its former self, rebuilt in name, but hollow in spirit. The veterans who had once flown with calm precision were gone, lost at Midway, or scattered across the Pacific. In their place came boys, 17, 18 years old, barely trained. Some had never even landed on a carrier deck before. They were handed flight manuals, offered prayers, and told that courage would make up for everything else. Their instructors whispered the same promise: the spirit of Bushido cannot be defeated. But the world had changed. Spirit couldn't outfly radar. Pride couldn't outmaneuver technology. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea shimmered under a brutal sun. Japan's rebuilt carrier force, including Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, launched wave after wave of aircraft toward the American fleet. From the decks below, the young pilots looked fearless, but their hands trembled as they gripped the controls. They were flying into an invisible wall, one made of radar-guided guns and seasoned American aviators. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. U.S. fighters tore through Japanese formations before they even reached their targets. Torpedo planes fell into the sea like rain. Bombers disintegrated mid-air. By evening, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft had vanished. American losses? 29. The pilots who survived called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japan, it was a massacre, the end of its air arm in a single day. But the ocean wasn't finished yet. The brand-new carrier Taiho, pride of the fleet, took a single torpedo hit from an American submarine. At first, the damage seemed minor, but gasoline fumes spread through her ventilation systems, turning her into a floating bomb. Hours later, one spark, one tiny mistake, ignited the ship. The explosion tore her apart from within, killing over 1,000 men. Nearby, Shokaku was struck by multiple torpedoes and sank swiftly, her decks erupting in sheets of fire. Survivors described the sea itself catching flame, the water burning, the sky raining steel. In a matter of hours, 2 of Japan's finest ships were gone, not because of enemy bombs, but because of the same fatal flaws that had haunted their design from the start. Too much fuel, too little armor, too much faith. By the time the fires burned out, Japan's carrier force was finished in all but name. The admirals could still draw up charts, still issue orders, but they were commanding ghosts. The men who launched from those decks knew the truth, that the Empire's dream of naval supremacy had died over the Philippine Sea. The young pilots who never returned became numbers in a ledger that no one dared read aloud. And yet, in Tokyo, speeches still promised victory. Faith still filled the gaps where logic should have lived. The Empire would not surrender, even as the ocean took its final revenge. For the Japanese carrier fleet, the Philippine Sea wasn't just a defeat, it was an execution, and the worst was still to come. By late 1944, The Japanese carrier fleet was dying faster than it could be rebuilt. Each new ship launched felt less like a weapon and more like a prayer, a desperate offering to a war that had already been lost. Steel was scarce, fuel scarcer still, and yet Tokyo's high command clung to the illusion that new carriers could turn the tide. But a ship without trained men is just metal. A carrier without skilled pilots is just a coffin waiting for the sea. The veterans who had once defined Japan's aerial supremacy were gone. Their replacements were rushed through flight school in weeks, sometimes taught in gliders to save fuel. Many had never even seen open ocean before boarding their first ship. Still, they saluted, bowed, and whispered the same words, "For the Emperor." Then came Taiho, Shokaku, and Shinano. 3 floating monuments to hope, undone by the same ghosts that had haunted their predecessors. We already saw how Taiho vanished in a single explosion during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, her crew suffocated in gasoline fumes. Hours later, Shokaku joined her at the bottom of the ocean, struck by torpedoes and swallowed by fire. And then there was Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, a behemoth of 72,000 tons converted from a battleship hull. She was meant to be unsinkable, a steel answer to the Empire's suffering. But she sailed on her maiden voyage with an untested crew and unfinished bulkheads. When an American submarine found her less than a day from port, 4 torpedoes punched through her side. The crew panicked. Doors were left open. Pumps failed. Within hours, the great Shinano rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. 72,000 tons of pride gone in silence. Each sinking was more than a tactical loss. It was a moral unraveling. The sailors who survived spoke in whispers, haunted by what they'd seen. They had been told spirit could overcome material weakness, that faith could smother fire. But faith burns just as easily as fuel. Every explosion, every scream, every flicker of flame proved that courage alone could not stop the laws of physics. Still, the Empire demanded sacrifice. When there were no more trained aviators left, Japan turned to desperation and the unthinkable. If their men could no longer defeat the enemy and return, then they would not return at all. By the end of 1944, the great carriers of Japan had become tombs. Their decks no longer carried fleets of planes returning from victory. They launched boys who knew they would never land again. The Empire's fleet, once the sharpest blade of the Pacific, had rusted in its own ideology. Every ship that left harbor was swallowed by the same fate. Explosions, smoke, silence. The ocean, once Japan's path to glory, had become its grave. And as the last carriers limped home, scarred and half-sunk, the war they had begun with pride was about to end in something far darker. The age of the warrior was dying. The age of the kamikaze was about to begin. By 1945, Japan's carrier decks were no longer runways of power. They were gateways to death. The empire that had once built the most formidable naval air force in the world was now out of planes, out of fuel, and out of men. The few that remained were boys, barely out of school, taught not how to fight, but how to die. They studied maps not to plan a return route, but to learn where their bodies would fall. The word kamikaze, divine wind, entered the empire's vocabulary not as a tactic, but as a prayer. If Japan could no longer win through strategy, then it would win through sacrifice. The carriers that had once launched waves of trained aviators now became altars. Each mission began with bows, tears, and photographs pressed into trembling hands. Mothers sent letters wrapped with locks of hair. And then the engines roared, and the sky swallowed them whole. On those decks, silence had a different weight now. The crews no longer celebrated takeoffs. They stood motionless, watching as the last planes they had would climb into the clouds, each one a man they'd eaten with, joked with, shared cigarettes with. They watched until the dots vanished on the horizon, and no one expected them to return. The sound of the engines faded into the wind, and the only thing left was the smell of oil and salt. When American fleets approached Okinawa, Japan unleashed its final fury. Thousands of kamikaze sorties, each pilot determined to drag an enemy ship into the abyss with him. It was not strategy. It was despair turned into doctrine. The sky filled with burning wreckage, not just of planes, but of a nation's soul, and the carriers that launched them were dying too. With no aircraft left to protect them, ships like Amagi and Katsuragi became stationary targets, colossal steel carcasses waiting for the inevitable. American bombers rained destruction from above, reducing them to molten wrecks at anchor. Entire crews died at their posts, their bodies buried in twisted decks. Survivors later described the silence that followed as unbearable. It was, one said, as if the sea itself had stopped breathing. The empire that once believed itself guided by the gods now found itself praying to ghosts, and every time a ship went under, another chapter of that faith sank with it. By summer's end, the rising sun flag no longer rose over the Pacific. What remained of Japan's fleet sat broken in harbors, blackened by fire, surrounded by the silence of defeat. The dream of the decisive battle, the myth that had built this entire war, was dead. But for the men who had lived it, there was no relief, no redemption, only questions that no one dared ask aloud. How had it come to this? How had courage become a curse? The answers would come slowly, whispered among survivors, written in letters never sent, and scattered across the wrecks that still sleep beneath the waves. The kamikaze horizon was the empire's final act, a surrender disguised as devotion, a tragedy that mistook sacrifice for salvation. When the fires finally stopped, Japan was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. The ocean that once carried her dreams of empire now carried only wreckage, twisted hulls, shattered planes, and the bones of 25,000 men who had once believed they were invincible. The carriers that had symbolized Japan's modern might, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Shinano, all gone. Not one of them remained afloat by the war's end. Each ship was now a tomb, resting beneath cold Pacific waters. But the real wreckage wasn't just steel. It was human. In villages across Japan, telegrams arrived like funeral bells. Mothers fainted on doorsteps. Fathers bowed their heads in silence. Entire neighborhoods lost every son they'd sent to sea. And yet, the official message never changed. Their deaths were honorable, their sacrifice divine. Honor became the empire's last illusion, the only thing left to cling to amid the ashes. For the survivors, returning home was almost worse than dying at sea. They stepped off trains to find strangers in their own towns, homes bombed to rubble, families gone. Some were blind from burns, others carried scars that would never heal. They were told to be proud, to speak of duty, but they could only remember the screams, the smell of gasoline, the sound of steel buckling under heat. They didn't see glory in what they'd lived through. They saw waste, waste of life, of faith, of youth. The empire that had promised them immortality had delivered only grief, and still, in the public squares and shrines, officials preached the same old words: Bushido, sacrifice, destiny. But the men who had seen the oceans swallow their friends knew better. Spirit had not saved them. It had consumed them. And in that silence, Japan began to understand what it had truly lost. It wasn't just a war. It was a generation, an entire culture that had believed obedience could conquer physics and willpower could outbuild industry. The myth of the decisive battle had taken everything: the ships, the men, the pride, and the future. When the emperor finally spoke, when his voice crackled over the radio, surrendering for the first time in history, the nation wept, some in relief, some in disbelief. others in shame. But beneath it all was exhaustion, a collective recognition that the fire they'd unleashed had burned too long, too hot. Japan's strength had become its own undoing. Today, the ghosts of that fleet still sleep in the deep. Divers who descend into their rusting halls describe an eerie stillness. Fish gliding through hangars where planes once waited to launch, beams of light cutting through the darkness like echoes of another world. There's no sound of engines, no orders, no shouting, just silence. The ocean has taken everything except memory. And perhaps that's fitting, because in the end, the story of Japan's carrier fleet isn't one of victory or defeat. It's a story of belief. Belief so powerful it blinded a nation, so absolute it erased an entire generation. And as the currents shift over those steel graves, one truth remains. Spirit alone can build legends, but it cannot save them. The Pacific is quiet now. Beneath its calm surface lie the remains of an empire's greatest gamble, the steel bones of carriers that once ruled the sea. Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Shinano. Each one a monument to ambition, each one a warning written in rust. When divers descend today, their lights sweep across twisted corridors and hangars where planes once waited for takeoff. There's no sound of engines, no echo of orders, only the faint whisper of currents moving through silence. It's as if the ocean itself is keeping the memory, because it remembers what pride can cost. The story of Japan's carrier fleet isn't just a military tragedy, it's a human one. It shows how faith, when chained to arrogance, can devour even the bravest hearts. The men who served on those ships were not villains. They were sons, brothers, dreamers, many still teenagers, who believed they were fighting for something noble. They had no choice but to trust the system that raised them, a system that told them death was the highest form of duty. And in that belief, they became the victims of their own loyalty. When Japan built its navy on Bushido, it didn't just forge warriors, it built martyrs. The tragedy wasn't that they failed to fight bravely. It was that they were never allowed to live bravely. In the end, the lesson buried beneath those waves is painfully simple. Courage cannot replace preparation. Spirit cannot outlast mathematics. And pride, no matter how radiant, cannot stand against the relentless truth of reality. America's victory in the Pacific wasn't born from divine favor or destiny. It was built from adaptation, logistics, and a willingness to learn from failure. Japan's defeat, by contrast, came from an inability to do the same. It was a nation that mistook conviction for strategy and sacrifice for success. And while the fire has long since gone out, its echo still hums through history. A reminder that faith without reflection can sink even the mightiest fleet, and yet, even now, the story of those men deserves remembrance, not ridicule. Because buried within the wreckage of Japan's carrier fleet is something deeply human. The eternal tension between belief and truth, between courage and consequence. The ocean may have taken their ships, but their story endures, rising from the depths with every tide. They remind us that progress and pride walk a razor's edge, and that behind every great empire's triumph lies the same question. What are we willing to ignore in the name of glory? The sea never answers, it only reflects. And as long as the wrecks of those carriers lie beneath the waves, the reflection remains, silent, haunting, and eternal.